Okay, I just drank way too much coffee, and I'm now gonna ramble about Marxism to you. I have had these thoughts bundling around my brain for a long time. I talked about them a little bit on my blog a while ago. I talked about them a little bit more on my blog recently. I talked about them a little bit in the video Posthumanism. But I really want to put them all in one place in as clear terms as possible. And I think this is the way to do it. Um, so I'm going to try and expound. Is that a word? Expound? I don't know if that's a word. I'm going to try and opine regarding my esoteric Marxism, and I have uh, numerous notes contained within this strange device, which I will be referring to. So if you see me looking down there, so people kept telling me to read theory. You know, people do that. Lefties, they're like, read theory. They actually stopped doing it. But there was a while there when all anyone would say was read theory. And because I'm autistic, I took that to mean I should actually sit down and read theory rather than, I don't know. I don't know what they meant because no one ever actually did it. But I actually took it literally and I started reading theory. I read, I mean, I was already reading some stuff, but I actually sat down and started reading Marx in particular. And I noticed a few things while I was reading through Capital and Go the Critic and a few other things from Marx. And I started to notice a particular tendency. I'm going to hold this because the text is quite small. And I'm wearing sunglasses indoors in a dark room, so it's kind of hard to read. Started noticing a particular tendency, sort of under the radar, in Capital and in Marx. And I started to look into it. I started to research on the internet, and of course, it turns out I'm not the first person to notice this. You know, there's, for example, I was specifically interested in the labor theory of value. I've always had a back and forth sort of relationship with the labor theory of value in my mind, where I've gone back and forth on whether it's bullshit or whether it's actually 100% correct or like what. I've gone back and forth numerous times, whether it's like a tautology, you know. And when I actually started reading Marx, I noticed something subtle, sort of when he's talking about value and when he's talking about labor and its relation to value. Sometimes it's not so subtle, but there was something under there that it's not like immediately apparent. It's not the sort of thing you would get by reading Wage, Labor, and Capital, for example. Um, so yeah, it turns out I'm not the first person to notice this. There's a whole thing regarding what they call wertkritik. My German is terrible. Wertkritik, value criticism, the neue Marx-Lektüre, um, Michael Heinrich, etc. And in particular, this whole thing is kind of called value form theory. And this is why I first heard the term esoteric Marxism, which I just thought was too good to pass on. So that's what this video is called. Um, and it is very literally esoteric in the sense that, like, in the traditional sense of the meaning of esoteric, as in, like, there's a hidden message within the text. So it emphasizes a sort of hidden or de-emphasized element in Marx. And the theory is that Marx de-emphasized this stuff because he didn't think it was particularly important, specifically because he really wanted the power of the existing fairly strong labor movement. He wanted to convince the labor movement to sort of join in on what he had going on, get them to become communists, and that would lead to the revolution or whatever. And they already had an attraction to a certain form of the labor theory of value. He thought they wouldn't necessarily understand his particular theories of value and that they weren't particularly relevant anyway because you would be doing the same thing either way. But, like, you know, myself and some of these other value form theory people think that this was a tactical error from Marx to sort of rely on the labor movement in this way. We'll get into why that was later. Also, that Engels did not understand this aspect of Marx. He never really got it. It's also important to note that perhaps a reason why this element is under-explained or remains as a sort of hidden between the lines aspect of Capital is because Capital is an unfinished work, right? Like this is not something that most is often emphasized in traditional Marxist readings. That like Capital volume, firstly, Capital was supposed to be like 10 volumes. Okay, only 3 of them exist. Only volume 1 was Marx finished and published it in his lifetime. Volumes 2 and 3 were compiled after Marx had died by Engels from Marx's notes. Right, like they're not even strictly speaking written by Marx. And he had wanted to do a whole bunch of other volumes in which presumably he would have expanded on all of this stuff to some extent, but he didn't. It's also not clear to what extent he even understood what he had stumbled upon. Right, he clearly knew something because at some point he talks about a particular very very key element of this esoteric Marxist value form stuff, which is the double character of labor, or the twofold character of labor. And he says in Capital that this is like his greatest discovery. This is his big contribution to economics, which is interesting because it's not even really economics. It's more like a social theory or whatever. I don't even know. I don't know if you'd call it sociology, but it's yeah. And yeah, maybe there's also the possibility that Marx would have completely disagreed with this reading. That this is, who fucking cares? Basically, like if you can get something useful out of it, it doesn't really matter. Death of the author and all that stuff. Um, so yeah, setting the stage. Wait, there was something else I wanted to mention or whatever. So let's get into it. Let's actually get into the theory stuff now. I'm assuming that I'm already going into this, assuming that you're relatively familiar with Marx. You just have to be a little bit familiar with Marx. The traditional idea regarding Marx's theory of value, right, is that he's basically taking the existing labor theory of value as espoused by Ricardo and Adam Smith. There you go. Remembered the name eventually. Adam Smith, and he sort of perfected it or expanded it. But this theory disagrees with this. That actually he was disagreeing with the existing labor theories of value, and this is to some extent a labor theory of value, but in a very very different way than how you traditionally would think about the labor theory of value. In fact, go open up your PDF of Capital right now and Control F for labor theory of value, and you won't find it in there because Marx never says the term labor theory of value. Which is interesting that it is so closely associated with him as opposed to like Ricardo or Adam Smith, when those guys were, yeah, whatever. So let's actually get into the theory part. So just to set the stage for the situation we're dealing with, we have at some point a feudal economy where peasants own their own means of production and etc. And then there is a process of primitive accumulation or enclosure, which Marx goes into great detail about in the final chapters of Capital. But to sum it up, land was forcibly appropriated from the peasant class. The means of production were forcibly appropriated from the peasant class, producing the proletariat, right? Whereby now, so hold on, where are we? So peasants previously had. Let me put my cursor over where I'm at so I don't forget. Peasants previously had a number of powers whereby they had power over the means of production, decision-making power, etc. All sorts of interpersonal social relation type powers. And they became alienated from that set of powers by the process of primitive accumulation, who came in, divvied up the land that had previously been either owned by individuals or owned by individual families or held in common, and sort of took that land and appropriated it for themselves by force of violence, or they passed laws saying like you're not allowed to own above a certain number of cattle or sheep or whatever the fuck, or you know, like, hey, you're not allowed to have more than X number of looms in a private residence, so that you can't, have a literal cottage industry competing with a large scale textile factory. These are the sorts of processes that constituted the enclosure movement and primitive accumulation. Forcible expropriation of land and the means of production in general from the peasants, producing a whole host of people who had fuck all. They didn't own shit except their own labor power. In other words, the proletariat. Um, of course, coming from the word proletarius, meaning produces offspring, i.e., the class of people who only have their children and nothing else. They don't own anything other than their children, which is kind of strange because I don't tend to think about people as owning their children, but whatever. Um, so that's the stage. That's the situation that we find ourselves in capital. We have a whole bunch of people who don't own nothing and are alienated from a whole set of powers, and a bunch of much smaller group of people, the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, who own all sorts of stuff, means of production, and have access to a set of powers that the proletariat do not, but are alienated from their labor power. So, this is the important distinction. There is a twofold character of commodities. People seem to be able to wrap their heads around this. Commodities have a twofold character in terms of both use value, which you could translate as usefulness in some aspect. I'm just going to say use value. Usefulness is actually a pretty bad translation, but it might help you wrap your head around the sort of thing we're talking about. And on the other hand, you have exchange value, which will for now just be called value. This Marx just uses the terms exchange value and value on its own interchangeably. So you have use value and value. Use value is one aspect of commodities. Value is another aspect of commodities. But labor power is also a commodity. It is a commodity sold on a market for a wage. And labor power also has a twofold character. This is the thing that Marx said was his big discovery. You have, on the one hand, concrete labor. If you look at someone doing something, if you look at some guy making something, right? A carpenter making a table, you're observing an aspect of concrete labor. You're watching someone do something specific to produce something, right? Whereas abstract labor is a bit weirder. So abstract labor is only really measurable by or observable through money. So if an independent producer produces some good, let's say tables, the carpenter making a table, he has expended his concrete labor, concrete, observable, specific, particular type of labor, the labor that was required to produce a table. But the second he goes to market, and then he sells that table for some amount of money. Now there is introduced into the fray abstract labor, abstracted labor, the concept of a particular kind of conception of labor. Okay, and we'll talk about what that means. Without money, you don't have a wage system, right? And so this is why it's all dependent on money. So the idea that different kinds of labor are directly comparable to each other, are of the same kind, of the same type, is not a natural category. It's not a natural phenomenon. It is a social phenomenon that had to be invented, and it was invented particularly during the dawn of capitalism because suddenly everything was on a market rather than having specific markets for specific small quantities of commodities. So previously, in the feudal period, the types of labor which a peasant performed, farming and shit, weren't seen as directly comparable to the types of labor a priest performed, or a member of the clergy performed, right? Reading and whatever the fuck, copying books from one book to another and praying. Those were all seen as kinds of work in a sense, but they weren't of the same type as the agricultural labor that the peasants did. It wasn't even, you couldn't conceive of them as comparable in that way. And the same with the aristocratic class, right? The types of labor that an aristocrat did, to the extent that they did any, right? They made political negotiations with each other and tried to tax whoever the fuck lived in their territory, and perhaps trained as a knight and did all sorts of other things. That kind of labor was again not seen as directly comparable to priestly labor or peasant labor. Right? They were seen as these three categories of society were seen as very different, performing very different types of tasks that weren't comparable to each other, right? And in the same sense, it's not a natural category that different types of goods are directly comparable to each other, right? Like we might have, if you say, I don't know, 10 coats is worth some amount of money, 10, I don't fucking know, 10 coats is worth £100, and then also some quantity of linen is also worth £100. You can then express that in terms of 10 coats is worth some quantity of linen, right? But it's not unless you need to directly compare a wide variety of different types of goods on a single market, there's no need for that form whereby different goods are comparable in value like that, right? Different goods instead take on different use values depending on their physical form and the use which it has, right? So different types of goods everything being directly comparable in terms of money, including labor, different types of labor being directly comparable in terms of money, because labor power is also a commodity, right? Is not a natural idea. It is an idea. It is a social form that comes about because of capitalism, because of the process of primitive accumulation. And now you have a bunch of peasants running around they're not peasants anymore, they're proletarians, and they're forced to work for a wage because they have no other choice. So in a sense, right, it's true that labor is the source of value, right? You can see why Marx might say something like this: labor is the source of value. But what he means is, if you read between the lines, if you're a little clever, if you notice this little undercurrent, not that the content of labor produces a certain thing's value content, but rather that the process by which labor is abstracted produces the form which value takes in our society, right? The process by which some quantity of labor can be traded for X amount of money, and some other quantity of labor can be traded for X amount of money, and money becomes the thing, right, that connects everything, because you work for a wage, and some quantity of X commodity can be traded for some amount of money. So everything is comparable in terms of money, right? Comes about because of the abstraction of labor, the idea that you sell your labor power for money, for a wage. That is abstraction. It is that we take away labor as a qualitative thing, as something which has distinct qualities that aren't directly comparable, and instead we compare quantities of labor. We quantify labor into sums of money over time, right? A wage. We split up time, and it becomes a quantified abstraction of what the concrete labor was. Does that make sense? It's a bit to wrap your head around, right? Yes. Okay, I'm just going to hope that made sense to you. So it's important to notice that labor, concrete labor, is like, exists, is one thing, right? But abstract labor specifically exists in the form of labor time, right? Specifically, time is something very important here, right? So concrete, this is also something important about the dual character, is that the role which they play within the whole of capitalist relations is distinct. Right? The role of concrete labor is distinct from the role of abstract labor in capitalist relations. You can't observe abstract labor. This is something very important that Paul Cockshott doesn't understand. You can't go into a factory and look at someone doing abstract labor. You can't take a big survey of how much time it takes to produce something and whatever, and then take a big thing of abstract labor. No. It's only measurable in terms of money because it doesn't exist outside of capitalism. It is purely a capitalist abstraction. Okay, where are we at? Right. So the dual character is in the sense that concrete labor is exploited, right? You are forced to perform some act of concrete actual labor, right? Or starve. You are compelled into performing some form of labor in order to sustain yourself with a wage, right? And it's a particular form of labor. Whereas abstract labor, as we already said, produces the value form in some sense, right? The abstraction of labor produces the value form. So the abstract labor, which is performed, which your labor is sort of transformed into once it's sold, once its product is sold in the market, for money, actually participates, affirms the system of capitalism, right? So labor has this dual character where it of both exploitation and participation. This is something that gets pointed out in I think the Coming Insurrection or something like that, right? And they talk about it as if this is like something that goes counter to what Marx believed, but it's not. It doesn't go counter to what Marx believed. I figured it out. I'm fixing the problems here. Okay, they think Marx didn't think of this, and I'm thinking no, Marxists didn't think of this. Marx knew about it. I don't know if he knew about it, but he wrote about it even if he didn't know about it. Okay, so remember I explained in detail how we ended up in this situation to begin with through the process of primitive accumulation through enclosure. This is very key. Okay, this is maybe not the sort of thing that you'll see the wertkritik people talk about, but it's the sort of thing you'll see me talk about because I'm on this stuff. I also Thomas Nail also talks about this. So when we look at the enclosure movement, what happened? Right, you took some parcel of land, some land that existed, right, and it was sort of divvied out according to all sorts of obtuse, abstract local customs, right? You had, traditions and sometimes written contracts, oftentimes written contracts, but oftentimes those written contracts didn't actually represent how that land was being used in reality, right? And then you have the commons, in which case, with the commons, there is no, there might be rules like, okay, no one can I don't know, do whatever. Like there might be some limitations that apply to everyone, but in terms of the divvying up of land, there is no striation. There's no blocking of flows in Deleuzian terms, I guess. There's no whatever the fuck territorialization. I don't know. Uh, they're not legible. They're not quantifiable. That was a process of enclosure. Was taking this thing that was illegible, that was indeterminate, that was kind of abstract and deterritorialized in a sense, or whatever the hell, had all sorts of flows going all sorts of directions, and then cutting it up into very clear enclosed sectors where the ownership rights are very clear, and the ownership rights. Hey, this guy owns this particular piece of land for this capitalist, and it produces this much, whatever the fuck, right? And so the enclosure movement was specifically an enclosure of space. This is the key part. Wages are the enclosure of time. They are taking this thing that is abstract and flows and communal and whatever, and divvying it up into quantifiable clock time upon which wages are paid, right? And thereby, that is the literal meaning of that is what enclosure. It's the same process as the enclosure of space. Wage labor is the same process as the enclosure of space, taking place over time, over the realm of time, rather than over the realm of space. Does that make sense? I think I don't know. I don't know what you think of that, but let's see what you think of that in the comments. So making the whole idea of this criticism or critique, or whatever, is that the system thrives on the idea of taking something that was qualitative and turning it into something that is quantitative, right? Um, and making it all very legible, to take a term from James C. Scott, right? To make this making it very legible. And it's worth noting, before you say, well, what's the problem with all that? It's worth noting the coercion that comes with this process, right? That all of these processes of enclosure of both land and wage labor, of both space and time, come with coercion. They come with the forcible appropriation of land from the peasants, right? By violence or by threat of violence. And the same with wage labor, by um, coercion, by saying you have to do this or you'll starve, and or you'll end up homeless, and then criminalizing homelessness, and etc. Right? This is the very essence of class war. It is that this process of enclosure is always violent. It's always coercive, right? Um, and beyond that, it serves to instrumentalize human life towards production. There's that Marx quote of like, the more you save, the less you get to go to the theater and be a human, or whatever the fuck. That's a massive simplification. The greater grows his treasure, which neither rust nor time will touch, his capital. Something like that. I don't remember the Marx quote, but it's very relevant here, right? It's taking all of these unquantifiable, qualitative aspects that make life worth living, and dismissing them as irrelevant, to only focus on the quantifiable capital, right? Um, and so proletarianization leaves people not just without their own space, but also without their own time. Okay, so now let's ask the question, what is to be done? Okay, well, let's take as granted, take as a given, that attempts at communism have failed, right? The previous attempts at communism have failed. Whether, they even were attempts at communism in the first place, or whether they were Lassalist social democracy, right? You know about that. Ask me about that. Don't ask me about that, right? But they either failed from the get-go, never got off their feet, like the German failed revolution, or they succeeded but were crushed very quickly, or they succeeded for a while and slowly degraded into capitalism again, or whatever the fuck, right? None of them have worked, even to the extent that any of them were even attempting communism and not just social democracy. We're taking as a given that none of that worked, and that something has gone wrong there. And the thing that's gone wrong, well, let's just start off with the fact that Marx was made a tactical error in his attempt to associate his communism with the workers' movement, and it was a tactical error that made sense at his time, and he couldn't have possibly foreseen it going the way it was. But also, it was a consequence of his Hegelian dialectical way of thinking. He's trapped in this dialectical mindset, because as I believe this is in some endnotes. I think this is an endnote somewhere. That like the previous attempts at whatever communist movement by the workers' movement has been basically attempting to abolish a relation by affirming one of its poles. Because as we said, right, that labor has a twofold characteristic, where on the one hand, concrete labor is exploited, and the focus has been entirely on that, right? The concrete labor is exploited. We have to go back up the workers' movement, right? So they can end the exploitation. But on the other hand, abstract labor is participatory. It emphasizes capitalist relations. And so you can't abolish the relation by just emphasizing the labor end of the pole, the labor pole of the relation, the labor side, because the labor side is just as participatory as the capitalist side in some aspect, in this aspect of abstract labor, right? And so you're left with what is to be done. Well, there's no solution other than the only possible thing you could do, which is endorse the refusal to work, the refusal of work, right? Which is among the most ancient practices of humanity, right? There was people refusing to work in ancient Egypt, right? And there are people refusing to work to this day. To quote the coming insurrection, there are plenty of otaku in Japan, right? In China they call it lying flat and touching fish. I already went over this in my blog post on the subject. But you have the sun her gods, right? You got all sorts of shit. And in the West, we've had something called quiet quitting. But in general, you've just got a bunch of, this is the thing. I'm not saying that this is all that's needed for a glorious communist revolution to take place or whatever. But it has to, there's no, once you understand this aspect of how value works, you can't possibly have any other starting point than the refusal of work as the beginning, as the very basis, as the smallest atom of whatever social movement, right? It's the only thing that makes sense, at least as far as I can tell. But of course, you can't actually, it's not practical for everyone to just stop going to work because you'll starve. You're never getting UBI, by the way. That's another thing that this theory predicts. You're never getting UBI. You will never get UBI. If you read Marx like this, you can find all sorts of predictions about how the welfare state will fail, right? And how goals like UBI will never get implemented. Because if they did, it would support the refusal of work too much, and you wouldn't be able to reproduce one pole of the capitalist relation, and capitalism would fall. So that sort of thing will never happen. You will end up in a situation endless where the welfare state, over years and years of class conflict, eventually builds up, and you get some sort of welfare state, and then it will all be taken away by capitalists, right? And you'll end up back at square one, and we're back at square one right now. And so, just simply refusing to work is not an option for most people. So, there's lots of things you could do. You can perhaps read my blog post if you want more information about that, because some of that stuff I don't think I should talk about on YouTube. But if you have to work, slow down. Workers of the world, relax, right? It's like this thing, Paul Lafargue. Funny about Paul Lafargue, he was not on board with any of this stuff, right? He was fully endorsed the labor theory of value in the Ricardian sense or whatever. And he fully thought that's what Marx was doing. Funny enough, Marx, in response to Lafargue, said if he's a Marxist, I'm not a Marxist, right? Basically. So maybe that's 1 point for me. But he, I think, makes a pretty good point, right? When you see all sorts of fucked up shit going on, when the workers have some sort of fucked up capitalist crisis or whatever, they bang on the doors of the factory and demand more jobs instead of demanding that the resources that already exist, the abundance of resources, are distributed equitably or whatever to that. And once you start talking about that, once you start talking about the abundance of resources that already exist and the refusal of work, then you start getting into some of this stuff, right? You can't even read this, too dark. This is The Accursed Sheriff, Volume 1, by Georges Bataille. And this is how it's possible to be a Bataillean Marxist, or a Marxist-Batailleist. I don't know what I want to call it now. Yeah. But this is where I'm coming in. This is my personal whole niche, is all in this, right? This idea where Marx will take care of the production side, Bataille will take care of the consumption side, effectively. And as much as I say, hey, it's all about avoiding the dialectical way of thinking, I've done so much dialectical thinking. I didn't say that. As much as I said Marx was trapped in dialectical thinking, I've done so much dialectical thinking, right? The twofold character of everything. And then Marx contra Bataille contra Marx, whatever the fuck, right? You can't get away from Hegel. It's too hard. He's everywhere, man. I don't fucking understand it. But look, there's where I'm coming from. That's the esoteric Marxism. Boom.